Today's daf we're going to be learning is Menachot Daf Daled. This week's learning is sponsored by the Hadron Zoom family for the refuah shlema of our dear friend and co-learner Phyllis Hecht. Gittel Pesha Bat Masha Rachel. Phyllis, you continue to inspire and uplift us with your messages throughout this time. Your Amunah is the embodiment of Hashem Ro'i Lo Echzar. May HaKadosh Baruch Hu grant you strength, healing, and stamina each and every day. Okay, we're going to get started with a quick review of what we've done because it's a little bit of a difficult start with a lot of confusion of what exactly Rabbi Shimon meant what he said. We're going to start with a quick review of the Breita. So Rabbi Shimon appears in this Breita. We have our Mishna. Our Mishna basically says any mincha that you do the shelo lishmah is basically ksherah, but you're not going to fulfill your obligation. Comes Rabbi Shimon in this Breita and says, well, no, you are going to fulfill your obligation. Actually, you do a mincha lo lishmah, it's ksherah, and you fulfill your obligation. The complicated part was that Rabbi Shimon in a different Breita seemed to say that you don't fulfill your obligation. So we had a whole question, what exactly Rabbi Shimon means. We had 3 resolutions. But really what we talked about at the end of yesterday's stuff is they sort of break down into 2. Because we have one approach by Raba, who basically says, Rabbi Shimon thinks that if you have a machshava that's so off base, we just ignore it, right? Because if your ma'aseh mochechim, your actions prove that you didn't mean what you said or what you thought, then we can go ahead and say the korban's completely valid. Which is why when he describes the contradiction between the Breita and the other Breita, he says, Rabbi Shimon, when he says you're yotzei completely, it's when you switch which type of korban, which type of mincha. And then it's very obvious that since you put it in a different pan, you obviously meant something different, and we ignore your machshava. When it's not clear, like you switched owners, or in sacrifices where it's all the same, then we're going to say it doesn't work. And then, again, it's kasher, but it's not going to work. And that's the way he explains the second Breita. But Rava and Rav Ashi think that sounds preposterous. They say, what do you mean? A machshava that's wrong completely disqualifies a korban. The more it's wrong, the more it's going to disqualify, right? Rava says, the first of it, the more it's wrong, the more it's preposterous, the more we could just ignore it. They say, of course you can't ignore a machshava that's wrong ruins a korban. We know that. You have to have the right intent. You have such bad intent. It's obviously worse. So they understand the whole thing, even though the simple reading of Rabbi Shimon is like Raba. They say, no, that's not what he meant. What he meant is you might have thought that because your actions prove that you really didn't mean what you said, still, right, that would all the more so want to say it's disqualified. However, and here comes the split between Rava and Rav Ashi, each one is going to say, why in this particular case, and they're going to have to say it's a very specific case, are we going to allow it here? Okay? And the reason we're going to allow it, according to Rava, is because one case he switched a mincha for a mincha, and the other case he switched a mincha for a korban. In other words, his thought was about a korban, an animal, when he was actually bringing a meal offering. Now, if you do it for an animal, of course it's not going to work, okay? Because it's really off, okay? But a mincha, and really because of a pasuk, by the mincha, if you do a mincha for a mincha, there's a pasuk that says, Zot mincha. That means all menachot are the same, basically. And if you switched a mincha for a marchesha for a mincha, a machvat for a marchesha for a machvat, it doesn't really matter. They're all really one and the same. But if you have a machshava about an animal while you're bringing a mincha, that's not going to work. Rav Ashi says, no, we're talking about your language. Did you say minchat marcheshet, minchat machvat, or did you just say machvat marcheshet? If you just said machvat marcheshet, so even though a wrong thought is a real problem, but if you just talked about the pan, so you were just talking about pans. There's no issue of my thoughts about or my intent about a pan. It's my intent about the mincha offering. So in one Breita where it said it's not disqualified, it was just talking about, you said this pan or that pan. When you said mincha in a pan, and mincha in a deeper pan, in the word, then you can disqualify it with your wrong thoughts. And then again, it's not disqualified, but you won't fulfill the obligation. The owner won't fulfill the obligation. Okay, that was what we had until now. So we're going to start, and then we ended yesterday's class with what was each one, why did he have a problem with the other, why didn't he accept the commentary of the other. Now comes the Gemara and says, 4 lines from the bottom, Milta de pshita le Raba l'haigisa, or le Rava l'haigisa. What was clear to Rava on one hand, which is a machshava that's so wrong we can just ignore. And it was clear to Rava, on the other hand, that a machshava that is so wrong is clearly going to disqualify. Okay, so there are two total ends of the spectrum. Mibaile Rav Hoshaya. Rav Hoshaya actually deliberated about this. Now, I want you to know, geographically, right, Rava, Rava, and Rav Ashi are all in Babylonia. Now we're moving to the ones in Israel. So Rav Hoshaya, okay, either by Rav Hoshaya or Amrila, some people say by Minye Rav Hoshaya me Rabbi Asi. The Rav Hoshaya asked Rabbi Asi, these are people in Israel. They were discussing this, and he says, mincha l'shum zevach mali amar Rabbi Shimon. What did he say about a mincha for the purpose of a zevach, which again is so wrong, right? What did he say about it? So again, if he held like Rava, he'd say that's actually not going to be accepted. If he held like Raba, he would say that's completely accepted because it's so off that obviously you didn't mean that. Because in a minute later, when you go and take your mincha offering, it's obvious you didn't mean for an animal sacrifice. So Tama de Rabbi Shimon, here's his deliberation, and it's what we know of already. Tama de Rabbi Shimon, mishum machshava de mincha lo pasla. Is it because he says a machshava that's so clearly wrong doesn't disqualify like Raba, and therefore ha machshava de mincha, and this is a clearly wrong machshava. O dama Tama de Rabbi Shimon mishum tirtiv v'zot Torah mincha v'zevach lo ktiv. Where's his reason? Because it says zot Torah mincha. So a mincha for a mincha, we can say, oh yeah, that works. But a mincha for a zevach, if your thought was about an animal sacrifice, when you're in the middle of doing a mincha, that completely disqualifies. There's no pasuk that says, oh yeah, mincha and zevach all the same. So Amar Le, which is basically Rava, right? Amar Le, klum higanu l'sof da'ato shel Rabbi Shimon. So Rabbi Asi answers him and says, look, we really haven't understood Rabbi Shimon. We just don't know. Okay, so if you're confused, if they were confused as well, they don't understand what really Rabbi Shimon meant. So now the Gemara wants to know, very similarly to what we did at the very end of yesterday's daf, which is, why didn't they hold like one of these three opinions of the Amorae Bavel? Okay, the assumption is they kind of knew that those were possibilities. Whether they did or not is a good question, right? We're in the Babylonian Talmud. To them, the Babylonian is the center of everything, what they must have known about these three opinions. Whether or not, we don't know. But anyway, the point being, what's the difficulty in each of them? And it's going to be a little similar to the previous, but I want to point out, yesterday, when we started, the one difference is going to be, we're going to go through the three and say, well, this because of that, and that because of that, and that because of that. Last time, at the end of yesterday's daf, we said, why didn't they all hold like Raba? And that's because they had a completely different approach about machshava, right? They didn't like Raba because Raba said, a bad machshava, we just ignore, right? Such a lie, such a falsehood. Clearly, it means nothing. And they are of the opposite opinion. They think it actually is, you can't just ignore a machshava. That for sure disqualifies. So that was the reason. You can't say that here because that was exactly his deliberation. You can't say he favored one over the other because he didn't, right? That was his whole question. So instead of that, they bring a different difficulty. Now you have to go all the way back, not so far, but to Daf Bet. If you remember there, the second Braita was all about based on the asham. And Rabbi Shimon said, we learned from the asham, just like the asham is kasher, but didn't work for the owner, also the mincha. And then we said, but how did Raba explain? Well, that's only b'shinoi ba'alim, when it's not noticeable. So Abaye had said, I don't get it. If you're learning it from asham, learn it all the way. Whether it's shinoi ba'alim or whether it's shinoi kodesh, whether you change the type of korban or type of mincha, right? It should be just like asham, it's both of those are included. Then by the mincha that's being learned from the asham, both should be included as well. So that is a weakness in Raba. And this is going to be exactly like we ended yesterday. He didn't agree with Rava because Mishum Kusha did Zot Torah chatat. Remember, we asked the question: if you say Zot Torah mincha means you could do a mincha for the sake of a different mincha, you could also do a chatat for the sake of a different chatat. And we don't learn that from the Zot Torah chatat. So that's a weakness because that was the whole basis of Rava is the Zot Torah mincha. Rav Ashi lo mishane le'Mishum Kusha de Rav Achabarei de Rava, because Rav Ashi said only when it's a vessel and the talk is about the vessel. But if you remember, Rabbi Shimon gave two examples. He said mincha for machshava for mincha, and he also said chareva mishum belula mishum chareva, with or without the oil, and there it has nothing to do with a vessel, so why would that one also be completely good? And we answered it because we said belula isn't really mincha, and we don't call a mincha belula, but still the difficulty could stand. Also, by the way, all the other difficulties, we resolved them somehow. Okay. Now we're moving on. So that ends that whole sugya with Rabbi Shimon, and that's why I did a little summary today to kind of bring it all back together. And as a basis for what we did today, you had to really get all that down pat, but we're finished with that whole sugya. Now we're going back to the Mishnah. Okay, forget Rabbi Shimon, we're going to put him aside for right now. The Mishnah had said all the menachot are valid if they're done shelo lishmah, just they don't fulfill the obligation. We have Rabbi Shimon who said they do. Now we're going to move on to the other part, except for, what are the exceptions? There's 2 exceptions where it's completely disqualified. What are those 2 exceptions? The minchat choteh and the minchat kenaot. Now we need to find the source for that. So we kind of said simply, well, they're like sin offerings, but you still need more than that. That's not sufficient, okay? And you'll see why as we go through the sugya. We're going to have really 2 attempts, okay? I'll structure what we're going to do right now. We're going to start with splitting them and saying we have one source for one source for the other. Although in the end, both are really learned from the sin offering. Then we're going to have a problem because of the asham. Theoretically, whatever we just built up, or at least for one of them, we're going to say the asham is going to reject that, and then we're going to reject actually both of them. Okay, when we resolve the difficulty of the asham, we're going to actually have to knock out both of the answers, right? Which, again, one answer is for the minchat, the choteh, and one is for the kenaot, the Sotah one. Then we're going to have to bring a whole new answer. Okay, and then we'll raise the difficulty from the asham also there, and then we'll resolve that as well. Okay, and that will take us to the end of Amud Aleph. So, chutz minchat choteh and minchat kenaot. Bishlama minchat choteh chatat karya rachmana. That's the easiest. The minchat choteh is a mincha offering for a sin. If you remember, even it's a sliding scale offering. If you sinned, right, if you had the money, you would do a regular chatat, right? Again, it's a chatat olav yoreh, but it's a chatat. It's a sin offering, which we know the sin offering, if it was done shelo lishmah, it's disqualified. So therefore, we'll say the same thing for this mincha offering that's also basically a sin offering, and it's called a chatat also. How do we know it's called a chatat? Well, it says in the pasuk, we're in chapter 5, which talks about the sliding scale offering, verse 11. We're going to see a lot of verses today, mostly in Vayikra. Lo yasiv ala shemen v'lo yiten ala levona. This is a sin offering. We're going to talk about this soon, about why it has no oil and no frankincense, like many of the menachot do. Ki chatati. Okay, there you have it. It's a chatat. Okay, right now we're focusing on the chatat. Later we're going to focus on the he. But right now we're on the word chatat. But remember that the word he appears here because it's going to play a role later. Okay, so that's very simple. Although, as I told you, we're going to eventually reject this. Ela minchat kenaot minalam, but the mincha that a husband brings for his wife, like he brings if his wife is a Sotah, if he accuses her of being a Sotah, we don't know if she really is, but he accuses her and then he brings her to the temple and then he brings this sacrifice to the temple. It's a barley offering. How do we know that if it's done shelo lishmah, it's disqualified? Okay, we need to wait a little bit. We're going to start with something and then connect it back. So the first thing that happens in this scene is Tane Tana Kameh de Rav Nachman, a person who is called a Tana. He's not really a Tana. A Tana is a Tanaitic person. A person lives in the time of the Tanaim. This is someone who brings Brightot in front of Amoraim. Okay, there were people who memorized the Brightot. So comes a person in the Beit Midrash of Rav Nachman, and he brings a Brightot to Rav Nachman. And here's the Brightot. Minchat kenaot motara nedava. Completely different topic, but it has to do with the minchat kenaot. This mincha of the Sotah, it's called the minchat kenaot because the husband kin'a beba'ala, he was jealous of her, and that's the word used in the text in the Torah. Kenaot, so that's why it's called the minchat kenaot. And also the Torah calls it a minchat kenaot. This comes from the Torah language. Motara nedava. Let's say, okay, we paid $20. We took out $20 to buy our minchat kenaot. Okay, and then we go to buy the flying flour, and turns out it costs less than $20. So we already designated this money. We've seen this with a lot of different situations before. It came up the most in shkalim, but we've had it in other cases. You have extra money. What do you do with that extra money? Because it's already sanctified. So it goes to nidava. What does that mean? It goes into the one of the 6 shofarot, which were like stucco boxes that were there were 13 of them, but 6 of them in the temple were meant for this purpose. All sorts of extra money that wasn't used, that was sanctified, goes in there and we buy public offerings with it. Okay, public voluntary offerings. So, okay, that's a side point, but it's going to lead us to our point. Amarle. So after he brings this Breita, Rav Nachman says to him, Shapir Kamarta. Great Breita you brought. Makes a lot of sense. Why? Because Mazkeret Avon Ktivba, okay, by the Minchat Kenaot it says, Ki minchat kenaoti, I'm in Bamidbar, chapter 5, verse 15. Minchat zikaron mazkeret avon. It's a mincha of remembrance, whatever that means there. And it's, what is it? Well, now we'll see what it means. What does it mean, remembrance? Mazkeret avon. It remembers the sin. Okay, assuming she did a sin. So now, why is that important? Well, bechatat ktiv, ota natan lachem laset et avon ha'edah. This is from, okay, we're going to have a lot of things we're going to review today from Zvachim also, which is kind of nice about this Masechet, which is this, if you remember, in chapter 10 of Vayikra, after Nadav and Avihu die, then Aaron and his sons burn the sin offering, and then Moshe gets very upset. We had a whole discussion about it near the end of Zvachim, what happened there, and Moshe says, why did you burn it? Why didn't you eat it? And then he says, because that you should have eaten, because that was supposed to bear the iniquity of the people, the sins of the people. What do you see there? The minchat kenaot is mazkeret avon, and the chatat is avon. Okay, so now we have what we call gezeirah shava. The same word appears in both. Here comes the gezeirah shava. It's going to be a two-part gezeirah shava. The first part is going to be about this right, and the second part is going to relate to what we're looking for. Chatat. Motaranidava. Well, a sin offering, if I spend too much money on, if I designate too much money for the sin offering, and then I buy an animal that's worth less, I stick the extra in this that goes to voluntary offerings. Minchat kenaot motaranidava. Same thing for the minchat kenaot. So therefore, he says your braita makes a lot of sense because we learn this gezeirah shava from the chatat. Now the gezeirah shava continues though. Uke chatat. We're going to learn another thing. It's also like a chatat in what sense? Ma chatat psula shelo lishmah, minchat kenaot psula shelo lishmah. Adds Rav Nachman this halacha, which is exactly what we're looking for. Oh, it's exactly like that. We learn out from the word avon, that also, if you did a shelo lishmah, it's disqualified. Okay, very nice. But I told you we're going to have a problem from the asham. Okay, yeah. Elameata asham ye pasul shelo lishmah de Gemara avon mechatat. So wait. Asham also says avon. Where does it say this? In chapter 5 of Vayikra, verse 7. Im nefesh ki tachta v'asta achat mikol mitzvot Hashem shelo te'asena v'lo yada ve'ashem. It says ashem in that pasuk. V'nasa avono. There you have avono next to the word ashem. There you have asham is also avono. In which case, what would you say if we make the gezeirah shava based on the word avon? Then the asham also is going to be disqualified if it's shelo lishmah, and it's not. Again, Rabbi Eliezer says yes, but the main opinion is no. To which they try to answer. They say, wait. You're making, we had gezeirah shava avon, maskeret avon, and avon. But, right, lasetet avon ha'edah. But you're trying to make gezeirah shava from the word avono, his sin. That's not exactly the same. It's not the same word. Now, you might remember how gezeirah shavas work, but usually they do work even if it's not exactly the same word. But they're going to try to say, well, and this comes up tons of times when they try to make these gezeirah shavas and they ask these questions, they say, what? It's not the same word. And then they always bring this classic example. Okay, you'll see in a minute. So they say, danim avon me'avon, ve'ein danim avono me'avon. Avon, we learn from avon, but you can't learn avono from avon, and that's why the asham is out. Gemara says, what? My nafkamina, what's the difference whether it says avon or avono? And we're going to have a two-pronged question. Number one, V'hatana debei Rabbi Yishmael, the famous, this comes up many, many times in Shas, because every time they ask this kind of question about gezeirah shava, they bring this up. In the Bayit Menuga, which is a leprous house, what's supposed to happen? First, you see something, you quarantine the house, right? The Kohen comes, looks at it, he quarantines the house. After 7 days, he checks, right? He sees there's some leprous mark. He wants to see what's going to happen to it in 7 days. Is it going to spread or not? Comes back after 7 days. It says, Uba Kohen, and then he comes. Comes after 7 days. If it's spread, he does this process where he takes out the stones where the leprous mark is. He then peels off like the limestone there, brings in new stones, re-puts the replasters. Okay, that's what it says. It says, what happens if it doesn't spread? You still have to quarantine the house for another 7 days, and the Kohen then comes back. It says, Vishav HaKohen. But the problem is, it doesn't tell you, right? And then it says, okay, then he determines it's a leprous house, if it's spread, but it doesn't tell you what he does. It doesn't say he's supposed to take out the stones and do all the same things as the previous. So the famous gezeirah shava of Rabbi Yishmael, and you'll see why it's famous, Because he says, V'shava kohen uba kohen. He makes a gezeirah shava between the word shav and ba. Now, shav is to come back, ba is to come. They're two completely different words. They mean kind of the same thing in this context, but they're completely different words. And he makes a gezeirah shava, and he says, Zoe shiva, Zoe biyah. Shiva and biyah are basically the same thing as the kohen coming to the house. And therefore, what it said after the first 7 days is what he does in the event that it hadn't spread yet, but it spreads in the next 7 days. He does the exact same thing, and there's a gezeirah shava with two words that are completely different. So obviously, avono and avon, you can do a gezeirah shava if you could do a gezeirah shava from v'shavu ba. Ve'od, second part of the question. Ligmar, you don't like that? You won't accept that? Fine, I got a different answer for you. Ligmar, avono me avon deshmiat kol dertivim lo yagiv v'nasa avono. If you remember this famous pasuk in the Korban Levi Yored, the first pasuk in Vayikra Hey is the Korban chatat. It says if you don't tell testimony, you don't say testimony that you have, you don't testify, and you lie and say I don't know any testimony, and you really do, then nasa avono, and you bring a chatat. So what do you see? Even in chatat, the word before avon appeared, here the word avono appears, and then you have a direct gezeirah shava, avono to asham. So now we're stuck. So they say, Ela ki gamre gezeirah shava lemotar nidavahu de gamre. He says, forget this. The gezeirah shava avon was true. Okay, you do gezeirah shava from the chatat to the minchat kenaot to the Sotah offering, but only for the motar issue, not for the lishmah issue. Okay, and that basically erases our proof. Okay, it's not from there, because if it was from there, we would have to say it goes to asham, and that we don't want to do. So we just erase that right now. Now, right now we've only erased one, but in a minute we're going to erase the original one about saying that the minchat choteh is a chatat, and therefore it's also like the chatat. Why? Because now they're going to say, now if you want to suggest that you can't do a partial gezeirah shava, and once you have the gezeirah shava, it has to apply across the board, we're going to have a different reason why you're not going to learn. In other words, you might say, wait, but if you're going to learn it from motar, you're going to learn it from gezeirah shava to the Sotah. But now we have to say, no. Theoretically, yes, let's say you do. So you're going to learn two things from that gezeirah shava. But there's a special pasuk that's going to tell us that no, you're not going to compare anything, and this is why we're going to knock out the first drasha as well, to chatat when it comes to lishmah. Why is that? To an animal chatat. Because Gale Rachmana, the Torah specifically told you by a chatat, v'shachat otah lechatat. This is the source for the whole disqualification of lishmah and chatat is you slaughter it for a chatat. Instead of saying shachat lechatat or something, slaughter for chatat, which it was already talking about the chatat. So why does it say otah? Otah is coming to tell you, otah lishmah kshera, shelo lishmah psula. This is, if you do it, it's going to be, if you do it lishmah, it's going to be kshera. If not, it's psula. Aval, but only in this unique case, not anywhere else. Aval kot kodashim, bein lishmah, bein shelo lishmah kshechayim. Okay, and now we're going to say that's a unique halacha specifically by chatat that can't be learned to anything else. So maybe you would think you can make the gezeirah shava all the way, but you can't, because there's a special pasuk that says this halacha of lishmah and disqualifying an animal chatat sin offering is only by chatat. Okay, so now we're really stuck because we've eliminated everything we did until now in this section. So the Gemara goes back and asks the question then. Okay, well if that's the case, minchat choteh and minchat kenaot psulin shelo lishma minalan. So now we have to explain for minchat choteh, because to say chatat we can't say, because the chatat was a unique law specifically by animals. You can't just apply that to every other place it says chatat. And the gezeirah shava also you can't learn to minchat kenaot. So chatatam amai. So now they're going to say, well, there was something extra here. And I told you we're going to go back to this word chatat hi. We're going to go back to it right now. Haktiv be. Okay. Mishum dichtiv bahi. Hachanami haktiv bo he or who. Okay, there's difference in different places. It's who, in different places it's he. We're now going to say, how do we get from chatat, that shelo lishmah is disqualified, to the minchat choteh and the minchat kenaot? Because both by the minchat choteh and the minchat kenaot, in both those places, the word who or he appears. And also in the chatat. Okay, let's go through the psukim. So in the chatat, korban levi yored, with minchat choteh, it says ki chatat hi. At the end of that pasuk, right? Don't put shemen, don't put levona. I told you to pay attention to that he, because it's a chatat he. In the pasuk about the animal chatat, this appears in Vayikra Dalid, the one with all the korban nasi and all those. It says, "V'samach yado rosh hasir." This is for the nasi. "V'shachat oto b'makom sheyesh chatat ha'olah lifnei Hashem chatat hu." There you have chatat hu. It's a chatat hu. Okay, all these are extra words. So there's a hu by the animal chatat. There's a hu by the meal offering chatat. And there's a hu by the minchat kenaot. We read it before. Ki minchat kenaot hu. Okay? So there you have it. Very nice. What's the problem? Also by asham. It says asham hu. So back to square one, almost. But this we're going to resolve pretty easily. So asham nami haktiv be hu. So they say, no, don't worry about that word hu. Ha hu, that hu, la'achar haktarati murimu dichtiv. That's written in a pasuk. I'm going to read it to you right now. It's in Vayikra Zayin, pasuk Hey. V'iktir otam kohen mizbecha. The kohen's supposed to slaughter them. This is, burn them, sorry. The kohen burns them on the mizbeach. This is the asham. Ishet laHashem, right, they're a fire to God. Asham hu. It's an asham. Now, if you want to say that asham hu in that pasuk is saying, this has to be done lishmah, what's the problem? It's after the burning. Where does it appear? In the context of the burning of the parts on the altar. Now, if you remember something from Sfachim, what are one of the things we learned there? What's the main parts of the korban? Shchita, right? What has to be done lishmah? Shchita, kabbalah, right? Slaughtering, accepting the blood, walking it, holacha, walking into the altar, and zrika, the burning of pouring the blood on the altar. The burning of the parts is after that. Doesn't have to be lishmah. And how do we know it doesn't have to be lishmah? Because huatz Moshe lo durim urav kasher. If you didn't even burn the imurim on the mizbeach, the whole korban would be kasher, because the korban really the main part end at the sprinkling of the blood. Okay, so basically, don't question the asham, because that who cannot be coming to tell you this has to be done lishmah, because it definitely doesn't. Because even it doesn't have to be done at all. Forget about being done lishmah. Okay, so now we have one small point and then we finish the sugya. So we're already really done because we've proven it's not what we thought before, because that's a chatat and that has a gezeirah shava of avon, because that didn't work. But even though it says v'shachat otal chatat, only this one's going to be disqualified, but then we have another gezeirah shava, which is who he, okay, or who he, right? Depending on, there's three places. Some places who, some places he, but it's all one and the same. And we're going to learn from there to the minchat kenaot and to the minchat choteh. And that's our answer. One last thing to just answer is, what do we do with the who, elahu lamali? So what's the who in the asham hu pasuk? That's for a different halacha, which we also learned at the end of Zvachim. L'chid Rav Huna amar Rav. It comes to teach you this halacha that Rav Huna said in the name of Rav. Asham shenitak l'riyah u'shchato stan kasher l'shum olah. If you took an asham, now remember, you have an asham that, let's say, I took an animal for an asham. Then I lost the animal. I took a different one instead, and then I brought the second one, and now the first one was found, and now I have an extra korban. What am I supposed to do with it? I'm supposed to leave it to graze. That's called nitak l'riyah. We send it to graze. Some people say nitak, because we're going to talk about that word in a minute, means the beitin determines. Rashi says it. The beitin issues a psak. This asham needs to go to graze. What happens? You leave it till it gets a blemish. You sell it. You take the money and you buy an ola with it. That's the only thing you can do with this asham. So Rav says, if it's once it's mitak l'riyah and it's been sent to graze already, or the beitin determined, and then let's say instead of waiting for it to get blemished, somebody slaughters it, shchato stam, kasher l'shum ola, it can actually be brought as an ola. Okay, this didn't tell us yet what the who is for. But they're going to say, look at his word, nitak in, lo nitak lo. But if you didn't yet, if it wasn't yet, let's say, we'll go with Rashi, the court determined that it's supposed to go to graze. If you hadn't yet done that, then what happens if you slaughter it stam? It's not going to work. Why? Because it's still an asham. How do we know it's still an asham? Amakra, hu behavayato yehe. Because it says asham hu, it stays an asham until such point that you actually switch its designation. And that's done with the nitak. Okay, that's a very side point. We're going to move back to our topic. We actually finished that section somewhat, because what was that section about? The korbanot that are done, shelo, lishmah, that are disqualified. And we finished because we finished when we talked about the two, and we proved their source. Good. What's the problem? Well, Rav comes along and says something that's surprising. I'm a Rav. Minchata omer, shekmatza shelo lishmah, psula. And minchata omer, that's brought shelo lishmah, that you did the kmitza, shelo lishmah, is disqualified. Okay, what's minchata omer? Let's talk about it. The day after Pesach, after the first day of Pesach, you bring an animal sacrifice and a meal offering of barley to permit, what's the purpose of this? To permit the new grains, chadash, right? The whole topic of chadash is from this. To permit the new grains. And the purpose is to permit the new grains. So comes Rav and says, what if you did the mincha offering, the meal offering, shelo lishmah? Ho'il ubat lahatil. The whole point is for it to come to permit the new grains. Now, if you do it shelo lishmah, it doesn't work, right? It doesn't work for the baalim. In this case, the baalim is the community. It doesn't work to do what it's supposed to do. So, what's the point? The whole point of it is to come to permit the new grain. If it didn't permit, if it didn't permit the new grain, well then it's a completely disqualified sacrifice. It has no purpose whatsoever. And let's say you take an ola and you do a shelo lishmah. It has a purpose. It's just a voluntary offering, right? It didn't work for the owner who needed to bring it, but at least it's just a voluntary offering. This isn't useless. Okay, this whole topic, by the way, it's going to come up more tomorrow. There's a machloka Rish Lakish about what exactly the purpose of the mincha omer is, and there's a gefet that's going to go off this morning, specifically from Rabbi Shimon of Drisha, about this topic, okay? This topic of the mincha omer and what's the purpose of it. If you want to go more in depth and hear about it, that's where to go. And by the way, that reminds me, I didn't mention in class about flashback, which is all about mincha and the word mincha and what it means and what a mincha is. It's an excellent introduction to the Masechet as well. Okay, so now he says, V'chein ata omer, and not only, okay, here he adds. Now, why is this fascinating? Because why wasn't it in the Mishnah, right? And not only that, he now adds another case for animal korbanot, which also wasn't in the Mishnah in Zvachim. V'chein ata omer v'asham nazir, turning now to Amud Bet, v'asham mitzora, the guilt offering of a nazir and a mitzora. Sheshachatan shelo lishmam psulin. If you slaughter them shelo lishmam, they're also disqualified. Why? Same reason. Ho'ilu ba'u lachshir v'lo ichshiru. What's the point of an asham nazir and an asham mitzora? Well, the mitzora can't come into the camp because he's impure and has to stay out of all three camps. The nazir can't drink wine, can't become impure to the dead. What does the korban do? The korban permits that. Permits the nazir to drink wine. Permits the mitzora to come back in the camp. So, right, the mitzora leper. So, again, he says the same thing. It's going to be completely disqualified because there's no point if you can't bring them. If they didn't work to do what they're supposed to do, then there's no point for them. To which the Gemara is going to start their questions that are obvious, which is, okay, let's start with the mincha. Tanan, it says in the Mishna, Kol Menachot shenikmetzu shelo lishmah kenaot, ela shelo alu lebalim l'shem chova, chutz minchat choteh minchat kenaot. Our Mishna said all the Menachot that were done shelo lishmah, took the kmitza not for the right reason, right? So for the wrong korban, they're good, but they don't work to fulfill the obligation. Now, except for two exceptions, the minchat choteh and the minchat kenaot, the Sotah one and the sinner one. Vim ita, and if Rav is right, litnei nami chutz minchat omer. Why didn't it say mincha omer there? So the Gemara has three good answers to this. They say basically, and they're all one and the same, the Mishnah only includes certain types of things. Number one, and we're going to basically say, and the mincha omer is out of all those rules. So the Mishnah is giving a list of certain types of korbanot, and they're ignoring, now why they would do that is a little strange, but ki katani ba yachid, ba tzibur lo katani, they're talking about individual offerings, not communal offerings. The mincha omer is a communal offering. Ki katane ba biglal atzma, ba biglal zevach lo katani. They were only talking about mincha offerings that are standalones, not ones that go connected to a korban. The mincha omer goes with an animal sacrifice. And third, ki katani hanachte en kavu alem zman, had kavu alem zman lo katani. They were only talking about ones that don't come at particular times of year. This one comes on a particular date. So for those three reasons, it just wasn't dealing with that kind of korban. Okay. Now, second question, obviously. Now we have to go back to Zvachim. First mission in Zvachim. Amar Mal. So again, first they're going to quote Rav, which is a repeat of what we just read. V'chein ata omer b'asham nazir v'asham mitzora sheshachatan shelo lishmah psulina lilu ba'u lachshir v'lo ichshilu. So again, the asham mitzora, asham nazir come to permit the nazir to drink wine and the mitzora to come in the camp. And if they don't succeed in that, well then what's the point of their offering? And therefore they're disqualified. But Nan, the Mishnah there said, the first Mishnah in Zvachim, kol zvachim sheshachatan shelo lishmah kshirim ela shelo alu lebalim l'shem chova, right? All those offerings are fine if you did them shelo lishmah, meaning they're good, you continue to offer them, but they don't fulfill the obligation of the owner, other than chutz mi Pesach v'chatat, other than Pesach in its time, remember on Yudalid Nisan, and the sin offering. Vim itan, if those should be there, litnei nami chutz min asham nazir v'asham tzorah, why aren't they in the list? The answer is, chutz min asham nazir v'asham tzorah, deba'u lachshir v'lo achshiru, right? It should have said, other than, also, not those two, because they came to permit the person and they didn't succeed. So the answer, kevan di'ika asham gzeirah v'asham mi'ila de lechapara atu lo psikale. Again, what the Mishna chooses to put in and put out, it's not like the other one where we were able to categorize, but the Mishna is not going to say something that's not completely 100% correct, okay, or clear. So asham, there's different ashams. Some ashams go one way, some go the other way when it comes to this issue, according to Rav. So the Mishna didn't want to say it because the asham gzeilot and asham me'ilot are actually kosher if they're done shelo lishmah. And the asham nazir and the asham tzorah are not. And therefore, it just didn't want to start up with adding there's an asham because it would have gotten confusing to people. So now they say, wait a minute. Mishna asham v'nazir v'asham tzorah deba'u lachshir v'lo achshiru. Hani nami ba'u lechapara v'lo kipru. Wait a minute. What's the difference between lachshir and lechapel? There's really no difference. And the asham me'ilot and asham gzeilot, what are they coming to do? They're coming to atone for sins. What happened? You steal. You lie about it. Your friend says you stole something. You say, no, I didn't. And then you lie under oath, and then you admit. So you have an opportunity to atone for your sin by bringing this korban. Asham me'ila, you misuse consecrated property by accident. So we give you the option to atone for yourself, right? You bring, you have an obligation, but you basically bring this korban to atone. Now, if it didn't work for me, then what did it do? It came to atone, and it didn't. Why is that any different than it came to lachshir and it didn't? Okay, right? It came to permit me back into the community or back to drink wine and become impure to dead, and it didn't. So this doesn't make sense. Now we're like a little bit stuck with Rav. Why did he make that distinction? Rabbi Yirmiyah comes to explain the distinction. Amar Rabbi Yirmiyah, matzinu shachileka kachu bein mechaprim ubein machshirim. He says I'm going to show you. There's a distinction between the two. In what case is there a distinction? And it's the same concept. After death, if the owner, if I or someone else was to designate a korban and then they die before they bring their korban, okay, what happens to that korban? Is it brought anyway? Depends on what kind of korban it is. And what Rabbi Yirmiyah is going to say, it depends if it's a machshir or a mechapel. Now let's think about the connection. If there's a korban after death, what does that show? That there is a point to bring in the korban even without the owner, or even if it was disqualified. It's the same thing, right? Because a disqualified korban doesn't work for the owner, but theoretically, if it could work for something else, if it could be brought anyway, then, so it's the same thing as after death, because both are basically ownerless. One is the owner's dead, and the other is it just doesn't work for the owner. So if it can be brought after death, then we'll say it also can be brought after disqualification. If it can't be brought after death, then it also can't be brought after disqualification. And Rabbi Yirmiyah is going to say that's the same distinction by machshirin and mechaprim when it comes to after death. Mechaprim itbuhu da'atu la'achar mita. With the mechaprim, things that come to atone, some of them do have a case where you can bring them after death. And machshirim leitbuhu da'atu la'achar mita. And machshirim, there aren't any that come after death. How do we know? Ditnan is a bit of a difficult proof. Okay, Rashi explains it one way. I found a better commentary that explains it differently that makes more sense to me. Hayisha shevia chatata. Okay, there's a woman who gives birth. She brings two offerings: a sin offering and a sin offering and a burnt offering, chatat and ola. So she brings her. Let's say she brought her chatat. Remember, it's two birds, and one goes for chatat, one goes for ola. What if she brought her chatat and then died? She actually could bring an animal. I'm not going to get into all the options, but let's say to the two birds. That's the classic. She brings her sin offering and then dies. So Yaviru Yorshim Olata, the Yorshim bring her Ola, which we're going to now say is a mechaper. Okay? Even though it's a little strange, this is what's a little difficult with Rashi, because, there's two things that go on. First of all, the pasuk says, Echad lo-ola ve'echad lechatat, she brings two birds, one for Ola, one for chatat, v'chiper aleh kohen, and the kohen atones. So clearly there's atonement here. And there's also hachshara. What's the hachshara? A woman can't eat. It says in the pasuk exactly there in those psukim there, she can't eat kodashim I forget the pasuk, but it says, she can't, I think that's there. Anyway, she can't eat kachim. She can't eat sacrificial meat until she brings her korban. That machshires her. Again, it's a matir. It permits her to eat the sacrificial meat. So what he's going to basically say is, okay, the way Rashi reads it, and then I'll tell you the difficulty with Rashi, but I don't want to harp on it too much. But he's basically going to say the chatat is the machshir and the ola is the mechaper. Okay? So, therefore, what do you see here? The ola gets to be brought because it's a mechaper. Olata umeta. But what if she brought her ola and then died? Lo yaviu yorshim chatata. Her heirs don't bring her chatat offering because it's, again, according to the way Rashi understands it, because the chatat is a machshir. It's a bit of a problem to say that, because how could you say a chatat's non-mechaper? Chatat's always mechaper. That's what a chatat's for, right? So it's a little difficult to say that, which is why some explain like this. He's not actually trying to explain machshir, no, chatat, yes, mechaper, yes. He's just trying to prove mechaper, yes. And what he's saying is the chatat is also mechaper. Just the chatat, there's an exception to the rule, because a chatat whose owner dies, there's a halacha l'mash misinai that says it has to be left to die. You can't do anything with that chatat anymore. And that's the reason for the chatat, which has nothing to do with it. The point is that both the chatat and the ola are mechaprim. And what it's telling you here is the ola that's a mechaper is actually brought after death. And that's all it's trying to say. And that actually makes a little bit more sense, because it's very hard to say the chatat's not a mechaper. So, and then it's not trying to prove the machshir, no, it's just trying to prove mechaper, yes. Okay, there is after death. And that's Rabbi Yirmiyah. Rabbi Yirmiyah says, I'm explaining this distinction between, which was really brought to say what's the difference between the asham nazir and asham mitzorah, which are machshirim, and which can't be brought if they're disqualified, lo lishmah, versus the asham me'ilot and asham gezeirah, which are mechaprim, which can be brought. Okay? And he says, basically, we see this distinction also after death. Machshirim are not brought after death, and mechaprim are. It's the same idea. But Matkefla Rabbi Yehuda Bereid Rabbi Shimon ben Pazi. Rabbi Yehuda comes and says, what are you talking about? Machshirin nami mi lepu de'atu la'achar mita. Aren't there machshirin also that come after death? You're trying to say, Rabbi Yirmiyah, the machshirim never come after death, and that proves there's no point to this korban, and that's why it's disqualified in the case of the minchat ha'omer, right? Which brings us back to there, or actually we're now talking about the asham mitzorah and asham nazir. Okay? So the asham mitzorah, asham nazir are machshirin, they can't be brought. And Rabbi Yirmiyah said, and that's because they can't be brought after death. I'm going to show you a case where it can. V'hatznan. Hamafrishma, okay, now we're talking about a nazir. Hamafrishma ot l'naziruto. And remember, the nazir, it's a machshir. So someone separates money for his nazirut. At this point, the person hasn't died. We're going to get to death in a minute. They haven't died. They just separate money. So what's the status of this money in the meantime? Well, here's 3 korbanot to bring. Okay? A shlamim, an ola, and a chatat. Now, he hasn't yet designated which money is for what. So at that point, since one of them is a shlamim, and the money, we don't know what it's designated for, lo nehenim v'lo mo'alim. You can't benefit from it, midirabanan, because, there's an ola money in there, and there's chatat money in there, which are me'ila, like forbidden to use. There's isra me'ila on them. But a shlamim, since eventually the owners eat it, actually there's no me'ila. The only me'ila in a shlamim is once you slaughter the animal, and then the parts are supposed to be burned on the altar. Those parts have after the blood is sprinkled, actually, then the parts that are supposed to be burnt on the altar have a din of me'ila. But the rest of it never has me'ila. Okay, that's a side point. Because theoretically, you could even take all that money and buy a shlamim with it, and then just take more money to buy your other sacrifices. Mate, what if the person dies? So now we're going to have 2 tracks. One is where the person didn't specify which money was for what. They just set aside $100 for the korbanot. So ayula ma'otz dumim, yiplula nidavad. They all go to nidavad. They go in that pushka that we said, that stucco box in the temple, and they just use them for offerings because, they could have been, usually things just morph into an ola when we don't know what they are because we're going to treat them the most stringently. Miforashim, this is what's important. If you already said, this is from a chatat, this is right, so you took that $100, you split it up, 40, 20, or whatever it is, okay, you split it up. Miforashim, Demei chatat, so the money you said was going to be for the sin offering. This is a chatat that the owner died. There's nothing to do with that money. Yolich liyam hamelach lo ne'anim v'lo mo'alim. You throw it in the Dead Sea. You can't benefit from it, but there's no me'ila because it's basically useless. You can't use this korban anymore. Demei ola, but the money for the ola, yavi behen ola. You bring an ola, right? The heirs take the money. They bring an ola with it, olim behem. There's a din of me'ila, because that's sanctified. Demei already, because it's supposed to go for a korban. Demei shlamim, yavi mehem shlamim. You bring the shlamim. Just since it was supposed to be a shlamim for the nazir, it has the unique laws of a shlamim for a nazir partially, which is nechalim liyom echad. Most shlamim can be eaten for 2 days. The nazir's it's only eaten for 1 day, so since it was originally designated as a nazir, we continue that. Ve'ein ti'unim lechem. But they were supposed to come with bread offerings, with meal offerings, right? These 20 loaves, but that doesn't go with it because the nazir's not here to do it. They died. Now, what's the point here? Ha'ola ushlamim de nazir de machshirin dinhu ve'ka'atu la'achar mita. Well, the ola and shlamim of the nazir are machshirin. And what do you see? You can bring them after death. So, Rabbi Yirmiyah, your whole differentiation to prove Rav, machshirin, don't come after death, and that's why they're disqualified, versus the mechaprim, which are, but this is a machshir, and it does come after death. So I'm going to stop here and leave you with this question, and we'll come back to this tomorrow. So we did 3 basic sections today. First, we took this Rav Hoshaya, and we did a review of everything we did until now about Rabbi Shimon, starting from Bet and Bet, the 3 opinions, and why was Rav Ashi confused about this and didn't want to hold by any of the opinions, and he was really left in a quandary about how to understand Rabbi Shimon. Then we moved to the mincha, choteh, mincha, kenaot. What's our source? That they're not lishmah. We tried one track for each of them, and then in the end, we had to knock out all of that, and then we had to go with the other track of the who, he, gezeirah, shava. Then we moved to this almost sounding crazy statement of Rav, which it goes against both Mishnayot, basically, that there's another case, both in the minchas and in the animals, where you bring it lo lishmah, and it's actually disqualified. And they had to explain first why it's not in the Mishnah, in both Mishnayot, in Zvachim and in Menachot, and we had to explain then, Rabbi Yirmiyah tried to explain to us, where we have this distinction between a machshir and a mechaper, and we're in the middle of figuring out that distinction. With that, we'll finish for today. Wishing everyone a good day.